Anthropometry, the first system of identification. Anthropometry, designed by Alphonse Bertillon, began in 1890 and lasted approximately 20 years before being replaced by fingerprint identification. Alphonse's father, Louis Bertillon, a famous French physician and anthropologist, largely influenced Alphonse's knowledge and interest in the human skeletal system. Louis helped Alphonse secure a job as clerk with the Parisian police in 1879, where he began to focus his research on the difficulty of identifying repeat offenders. I find it interesting that Bertillonage included probability calculation that long ago. It was determined that the odds for any one particular measurement being exactly the same for any two men would be 1:4. Thus, the chances of two men having the same height and same foot size, for example, would be 1:4 by 4. The chances for all 11 measurements being shared between two individuals would be 1:4 or 1:4, 194, and 304 at the same time. When the population was considerably smaller, this would indeed be very compelling evidence for identification. In addition to physical measurements, Alphonse recorded physical descriptors of the person, either hair and eye color, including any unusual markings on the body, either tattoos and scars. This was known as portrait parle or speaking portrait that described many personal characteristics. Lastly, Alphonse included frontal and side view photographs of each person, which we recognize today as mugshots. In order to make use of this information in days well before the invention of a computer database, Bertillon created categories to be able to classify and retrieve information cards that could be helpful in identifying an individual based on previous measurements taken. By 1884, Bertillon's system was able to identify 241 recidivists. In 1888, Alphonse Bertillon was promoted to head a newly formed Department of Judicial Identify for the Paris Police. This laboratory naturally lends itself to significant discussions after the lab about why fingerprinting is such a better system than anthropometry. Critical thinking resulting from the comparison of the two systems should lead students to realize that people do not leave their measurements behind at the crime scenes, but do leave their fingerprints. Also, discussions about the positive value of anthropometry are important to recognize that this was a starting point in an effort to be able to differentiate one person from another. Specifically, these claims were that the human skeletal system remains fixed from age 20 until death, and that due to the extreme diversity of the skeletal system, no two people would have exactly the same measurements. Although anthropometry lasted for only 20 years, it was the seed that allowed the science of identification to evolve as it did. It also provided us with the modern day mugshot and had not existed prior to Bertillon. Portrait parle. In 1882, Alphonse Bertillon, also called father of scientific detection, said that anthropology could be invoked to aid in the sight recognition and identification of criminals. Employing these methods of scientific description, Hoover carved a system of identification, utilizing 11 skeletal measurements which are practicably uncharged after maturity and are not affected by increase of loss of weight. His classification provided a basis for modern recall system that would aid the artist in producing sketches as well as the development of composite kits, catalogs, and computer systems. Originally, he meant for the catalog to be an identification and aid for recognition of local prisoners, but later it was found to be useful for obtaining description of unknown suspect also. Bertillon stated from the observations that human bone structures was more or less absolutely fixed by the age of 20, and that the skeleton varied tremendously in its dimensions between one person and another. Before DNA evidences and before that, the oblique adoption of fingerprinting became the dominant mode in which criminals were identified by law enforcement. Another form of biometric identification was widespread around the world. The portrait parley system, also known as Bertillonage, had a major impact on criminology, specifically in its native France. It was not until 1882, however, that Bertillon was given the opportunity to prove the validity of his system in the eyes of the project of police. After 3 months trial period, he was also able to identify a repeat offender by providing that the man who had just been caught on the crime scene or theft had indeed been arrested sometime before. Despite using a false identity, the criminal was betrayed by his own body measurements and quickly confessed. Advancement of Bertillonage. Whereas the anthropometric system made it possible to distinguish between two distinct individuals, it did not bring irrefutable proof of an individual's identity. While not fully managing to fix this major flaw, Bertillon designed the incremental physical description card that also called the Bertillon card, composing of four areas: anthropometry, a field of in which with topological descriptions of ear, nose, and iris; an incremental, a detailed physical description method which form the basis of portrait parley; photographic description, which he continually enhanced by defining a general protocol for face; an inventory and precise mapping of all specific marks to be found on the body, like scars, tattoos, moles, and the Bertillon card included spaces for description of the prisoner's eyes, ears, lips, beard, hair color, skin color, ethnicity, forehead, nose, chin, general contour of head hair, growth pattern eyebrows, eyeballs, and orbit mouth, neck, inclination of shoulders, attitude, voice, language, habiliments. 25 traits described in Bertillon card: gender, face shape, chin shape, skin color, hair type. It is curly, wavy, straight, widow's peak, color of eyebrows, eyebrow thickness, eyebrow placement, eye color, eye distance apart, eye size, eye shape, eye length, mouth, size up, thickness, nose size, nose shape, nostril shape, earlobe attachment, ear pits, hairy ears, cheek thickness, forehead thickness, hair color. Description of following features considered in portrait parley: face, oblong, oval, round, rectangular, square, triangular, diamond. Widow's peak. Skin color: very fair, fair white skin, light brown, moderate brown, dark brown, deeply pigmented, dark brown to black. Hair types: straight, wavy, curly, coils, undefined coils. Features of eyes: round, almond, droopy head, hooded, Asian, round Asian. Features: eye color: gray, green, blue, honey, brown, black. Distance between eyes: wide set, downturned, almond eyes, close set eyes, hooded eyes, almond eyes. Types of eyebrows: thin, natural, thick. Eye shapes: protruding eyes, small eyes, sunken eyes. These are bird styles: Hollywoodian, Old Dutch, Ducktail, Winfield, Pencil, Encore, Handlebar, Super Mario, Moton Cups, to name a few. Forensic odontology, the new dimension in dental analysis. Forensic odontology, a branch of forensic science, uses the skill of the dentist in personal identification during mass calamities, sexual assault, and child abuse, to name a few. This branch, not stranger to many, has been growing tenfold in its potential and its ability to bring the forlorns in justice, where a dental remains is the only available evidence. His role and importance in the judiciary is fast growing, and hence in-depth knowledge in this field seems than more than justified. Forensic odontology is proper handling, examination, and evaluation of dental evidence, which will be presented in the interest of justice. The evidence that may be derived from the teeth, the age in children, and identification of the person to whom the teeth may belong. Knowledge of forensic dentists requires encompassing of number of these disciplines, since the dental records obtained can identify an individual or afford the information needed by the authorized to establish identification of the patient. Identification unknown remains. Dental identification plays an important role when identification of remains of deceased person is skeletonized, decomposed, burned, or dismembered, and is invalid by visual or fingerprint methods. According to American Board of Forensic Odontology, dental identification can be divided into four types. 1. Positive identification. The ante-mortem and post-mortem data match to each establish that it is from same individual. Possible identification. The ante-mortem and post-mortem data have few consistent features, but because of quality of the records, it is difficult to establish the identity. Insufficient evidence. The data is not enough to form the conclusion. Reclusion. The ante-mortem and post-mortem data clearly inconsistent. Determination of a species. It comes into pictures when the evidence found at the scene of crime is fragment of mandible or just a single tooth, which is of few millimeters in size. It is possible to determine species by dental tissues because the dentinal fluids contains special information, which can be compared and analyzed using countercurrent electrophoresis with artificially anti-serum. DNA analysis in forensic dentistry. The sample of DNA analysis is isolated from the biological material such as blood, semen, hair roots, tissues, teeth, bone, and saliva. Specimen selection. In the decomposed post-mortem tissue, although DNA undergoes progressive fragmentation through autolytic and bacterial enzymes, the sequence of information is still present in the DNA fragment. Therefore, information is not completely lost even though the body has undergone decomposition. In the fresh cadaver, unclotted blood can be source of DNA. Forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropology can be described as the analysis of human remains for the medicological purpose of establishing identity. It is a multidisciplinary endeavor that applies the knowledge of biological anthropology and human osteology to cases where human remains are skeletonized or where a detailed understanding of the growth and development, morphology, or reactive norms of the human body can assist other disciplines in positive identification. Forensic anthropology and human identification. The role of the forensic anthropologist focuses on applying detailed knowledge of the development, morphology, and variation of the human body as an aid to establishing, confirming, or indeed refuting personal identification. The four basic biological criteria form the basis of any primary identification. 1. Skeletal or developmental ages, biological sex, living structures, and ancestry or racial affiliation. The stages of forensic human identification. Frequently, bone is presented for identification from the sites of accidental discovery. Either stray surface finds, detritus from river, estuary, or coastal context, or through excavation construction work, or from the sites to which a presumption of violent or wrongful death may be attached through police intelligence. In practice, the anthropologist may not always be able to identify bone fragments to a particular species, but they should be able to determine whether they are human through macroscopic and microscopic evaluation, depending on the elements of the skeleton presented for identification and the degree of fragmentation of the bones.